The steady, rhythmic pull of the suture needle through skin was the only thing that felt real. In the controlled chaos of the ER, it was my anchor, a precise task that silenced the screaming in my own head for a few precious minutes. My hands, usually trembling when I was alone, were rock solid under the harsh fluorescent lights as I closed a deep laceration on a drunk driver's arm. He'd survive. They almost always did. It was the people they hit who ended up on the other side of the curtain. I was just finishing the knot when the main doors burst open with a violent slam that echoed through the entire floor. Two men in sharp, dark suits flanked a gurney being pushed frantically by paramedics. On it, a man lay unnervingly still, his white shirt stained a horrifying, blossoming crimson. His face was pale, chiseled from stone, but his eyes were open, dark, and blazing with an intensity that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Every nurse, every doctor froze. We all knew who he was, Dante Moretti. And the silence that fell wasn't respect. It was pure, undiluted fear. A man like that didn't end up in a city hospital unless something had gone terribly, apocalyptically wrong. The attending physician, Dr. Evans, took one look and his face went pale. He started barking orders, but they were hesitant, unfocused. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict that was rippling through the staff. Saving this man could put us in the crosshairs of whatever enemy had done this to him. Letting him die could bring the wrath of his entire organization down on our heads. It's a strange kind of helplessness, being trapped between two impossible choices, a feeling I had become intimately familiar with in my own life. That constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that tells you there are no safe moves left on the board. If you've ever felt that kind of pressure, that sense that the walls are closing in and you're just trying to make it to the next minute, maybe you'll understand the story I'm about to tell. It's for anyone who's ever felt invisible in their own struggle. If that's you, I hope you'll stick around. Consider subscribing and liking this video, because knowing you're listening makes it a little easier to speak. The whispers around me confirmed my fears. They were talking about letting him go, about a wound too fatal to justify the risk. But I just kept looking at his eyes, which had now found mine. I moved before I even made a conscious decision. My feet carried me to his side, my fingers immediately finding the thready pulse at his neck. It was weak, dangerously so. He's bleeding out internally. We need to get him to an OR now, I said, my voice cutting through the indecisive murmurs. Dr. Evans shot me a look that was a clear warning. Reed, the chief of surgery, is 30 minutes out, and we don't have a cardiothoracic team on call tonight. Look at him. It's a lost cause. But I wasn't looking at the powerful Mafia boss. I was looking at a man whose life was slipping away by the second. I saw the entry wound, high on his chest, and knew a standard chest tube wouldn't be enough. It would require a thoracotomy, right here, in the trauma bay, a brutal, last-ditch procedure we weren't equipped for. It was reckless, potentially the end of my career. But as his men watched me with cold, unblinking stares, I saw something else in Dante Moretti's gaze. It wasn't a plea. It was a challenge, and in that moment, ignoring it felt like a bigger failure than anything my ex-husband had ever made me feel. I grabbed a scalpel and made the first cut. The hours that followed were a blur of adrenaline and metallic-smelling blood. I performed a procedure I had only ever practiced on cadavers, cracking his ribs to get to the source of the bleeding, my mind a fortress of clinical focus. The world outside that small circle of light ceased to exist. Dr. Evans stood back, his face a mask of horror and awe, while the other nurses became my extra hands, responding to my commands without question. Dante's men never moved from the doorway, silent statues of death. Just as the sun began to hint at dawn, I placed the final stitch. He was stabilized, alive. Against all odds, he was alive. But my relief was short-lived. Before any official report could be filed, before the police could be properly notified, his men disconnected him from the monitors, lifted him onto a private gurney, and vanished into the pre-dawn gray. They left behind a blood-soaked trauma bay, and me, standing in the middle of it all, covered in the evidence of my career-ending decision. The hospital administration descended on me like vultures, their voices a swarm of accusations and threats. I had broken a dozen protocols, and for what? To save a monster? I walked out of the hospital that morning with a formal suspension notice in my hand, feeling the familiar, bitter taste of doing the right thing and paying the price for it. The walk home was heavy with a familiar dread. My apartment building, with its flickering lights and peeling paint, had once felt like a sanctuary, but now it was just another cage. I saw it as soon as I reached my door. The deep scratches in the wood around the lock, the splintered frame. Mark had been here. He had a key, of course. He'd refused to return it, and the landlord wouldn't change the locks without a police report that the department, his department, kept losing. My breath hitched in my throat as I pushed the door open. Everything looked normal at first, but that was his specialty, subtle terror. Then I saw it. On my nightstand, the small, framed photo of my deceased mother was lying face down. It was the one thing I cherished most in the world, the one thing he knew I couldn't bear to lose. He hadn't stolen anything, he hadn't broken anything. He had simply entered my most private space to remind me that there was nowhere I could hide from him, that he owned me. The restraining order I'd fought so hard for felt like a pathetic joke, a flimsy piece of paper against a man who wore a badge and carried a gun. A wave of nausea and pure, undiluted terror washed over me, and I sank to the floor, my back against the violated door. The next morning, I was packing a go bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. I didn't know where I would go, only that I couldn't stay. As I stared out the window, trying to figure out my next move, a long black sedan, the kind that seems to absorb the light around it, pulled up to the curb. My heart leaped into my throat, thinking it was Mark, that he'd somehow gotten a new car to torment me. But the two men who emerged were the same ones from the hospital. They moved with a quiet, lethal grace, their eyes scanning the street before they entered my building. I froze, my mind racing. Were they here to thank me, or to silence the loose end, who had seen their boss at his most vulnerable? I heard their heavy footsteps stop outside my door. A soft, polite knock echoed in the silent apartment. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a long moment, a heavy envelope slid under the door. I waited until I heard their footsteps retreat and the sound of the car driving away before I crept forward. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with a dark wax stamp bearing an ornate M. It felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands, like the weight of a life I never asked for. I sat on the floor for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the seal. Breaking it felt like a point of no return. Finally, my desperation won out over my fear. I tore it open. Inside, there was no letter, no threat, just money. Stacks and stacks of crisp $100 bills, more than I had ever seen in my life. It was enough to pay off the mountain of debt my ex-husband had left me with, enough to disappear and start over, somewhere he could never find me. My mind reeled at the sheer silent power behind such a gesture. Beneath the cash was a single, stiff card. Typed on it were just a few lines. Your services are required for a private nursing position during my recovery. Your salary will be triple what the hospital paid you. A car will be waiting downstairs at noon tomorrow. Your safety will be guaranteed. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. A golden cage being offered in place of my iron one. As I held the card, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold when I read the words. It was from Mark. I saw your new friends pull up. Don't think for a second they can protect you from me. We need to talk. Tonight. The two worlds had just collided, and I was standing at the epicenter of the explosion. The money on my floor felt like a curse, a glittering pile of temptation and terror that I couldn't bring myself to touch. Mark's text message burned behind my eyes, a stark reminder that one monster's gratitude had just painted a target on my back for another. The next morning, the call came from the hospital. My suspension was now a termination, effective immediately. Reckless endangerment, they called it. Gross violation of protocol. They didn't say the real reason. I had saved the wrong man, and they were cutting me loose to avoid the fallout. Hours later, an eviction notice was taped to my door, its bold red letters screaming that I had 3 days to vacate. The debts my ex-husband had so carefully accrued in my name had finally caught up to me, and without a job, I was sunk. I felt the walls of my life crumbling, each brick a separate failure, a distinct fear. Sophia called, her voice frantic with worry, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't bear to put her in the path of the storm that was engulfing me. I just sat there, in the dark, with a fortune I was too scared to accept and a threat I was too weak to fight, completely and utterly alone. The black sedan arrived precisely at noon, just as the card promised. It parked across the street, a sleek, predatory shadow against the grimy backdrop of my neighborhood. I watched from behind my threadbare curtains as it waited, its windows so dark they reflected my own desperate face back at me. I didn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but a deeper, more wounded part of me refused to be summoned like a stray. My entire life with Mark had been about obeying, about anticipating the desires of a powerful, dangerous man to ensure my own survival. Accepting this offer felt like walking right back into that dynamic, trading one owner for another. I would rather face Mark on my own than willingly step into another gilded cage. The car remained, a silent testament to a patience I found more unnerving than any threat. Hours crawled by. Then my phone buzzed again. Another text from Mark. Saw your fancy ride. Waiting for your prince to come save you? I know where Sophia lives, Clara. I know her schedule.
Don't make me go say hello because you're ignoring me. The blood drained from my face. My defiance wasn't courage, it was a liability, and the price would be paid by the only person I had left. As dusk settled, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gray, the car outside remained. There was another knock on my door, firmer this time, less a request and more a statement of fact. Miss Reed, a calm, low voice said from the hallway, "My name is Leo. Mr. Moretti is concerned for your well-being." I held my breath, my back pressed against the door as if I could physically hold back his world. He was made aware of your termination from the hospital. He was also made aware of the eviction notice posted this afternoon, and he is fully aware of Officer Mark Jensen's escalating harassment. Hearing Mark's name spoken so clinically by this stranger felt like a violation, a confirmation of just how far their reach extended. They knew everything. They had been watching. "Mr. Moretti understands your reluctance," Leo continued, his voice unwavering. "But he feels a personal responsibility for the consequences of your actions that night. Your safety is now his primary concern. He is asking you to let him help." It was the most polite, elegantly phrased ultimatum I had ever heard, a velvet glove wrapped around a fist of pure, unyielding steel. I opened the door a fraction of an inch, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man standing there, Leo, was older than the guards from the hospital, his suit impeccably tailored, his face a calm mask of professional gravity. He looked more like a corporate lawyer than a mobster, which was somehow even more frightening. He made no move to enter, respecting the flimsy barrier of my doorway. Instead, he held out a slim, new smartphone. "This is for you, a secure line. Your personal device has been compromised. Officer Jensen has installed spyware on it. He has been reading your messages and tracking your location for weeks." The world tilted on its axis. Every desperate text to Sophia, every search for a shelter, every moment I thought I was alone, he had been there, a digital ghost haunting my every move. The sense of violation was so profound I felt physically ill. Leo's voice cut through my shock. Mr. Moretti is at his penthouse, recovering. The job offer is legitimate. He requires constant medical supervision. The protection is merely a non-negotiable part of the employment package. He will not allow any harm to come to his staff. The ride to the city center was a silent, surreal journey through a world I no longer recognized as my own. The armored sedan moved through traffic with an unnerving smoothness, insulating me from the noise and chaos outside. It was a bubble of quiet luxury, a stark and bitter contrast to the life that had been ripped away from me just this morning. We arrived at a towering skyscraper of black glass and steel that seemed to scrape the sky, a building I had only ever seen from the ground, craning my neck in awe. A private elevator whisked us upwards with a silent, stomach-dropping velocity, opening directly into the penthouse. The space was breathtaking and terrifying, a cavern of minimalist design with floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the entire city like a carpet of jewels. Dante Moretti was sitting in a dark leather armchair, not in a bed. He wore a simple black shirt, his arm in a sling, his face pale but composed. His dark eyes locked onto mine as I stepped out of the elevator, and in that instant, the sprawling, opulent space shrank to the suffocating distance between the two of us. He was a predator in his natural habitat, and I had just walked willingly into his den. He didn't speak immediately, letting the heavy silence stretch and press down on me. He simply watched me, his gaze analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. Finally, he gestured to an identical armchair placed opposite his. "You look exhausted, Miss Reed," he said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper and more controlled than I remembered. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed with the weight of profound insight, making me feel seen in a way that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. I want to be clear about my intentions. The money I sent was payment for saving my life. It is yours, regardless of your decision. The job is a separate offer. I do not force people to work for me. He was carefully handing me back a sense of control, a choice he knew I didn't really have. However, he continued, his tone hardening slightly, I have a strict personal policy. I do not allow my debts to go unpaid, and I do not, under any circumstances, tolerate men who prey on women. Your ex-husband has become my problem. It is a matter of principle. The cold, quiet rage simmering beneath his words was palpable, a promise of violence more chilling than any loud threat. My last vestiges of defiance flickered to life, a desperate need to believe I wasn't just a pawn being moved across someone else's board. I don't need a knight in shining armor, I said, my voice thin but steady. A flicker of something unreadable, pity perhaps, or frustration, crossed Dante's face. He said nothing. Instead, he picked up a sleek tablet from the small table beside him and turned the screen toward me. It showed a live feed from a security camera, the image crisp and clear.
It was focused on the entrance of Sophia's apartment building, and parked directly across the street, partially hidden in the shadows, was Mark's unmarked police cruiser. He followed your friend home from her shift tonight, Dante stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He's been sitting there for over an hour, waiting. Do you still believe your struggle is yours alone to handle? By choosing to save me, you became entangled in my affairs. That means your enemies are now my responsibility. This is no longer about what you want. It's about what is necessary. The image on the screen shattered my last illusion of control. Mark, my monster, was now laying siege to the one person I loved, the one pure and good thing left in my life. And it was my fault. My stubborn pride, my refusal to accept help, had put her directly in his path. I looked from the tablet, where my worst fear was waiting patiently in the dark, to the man in the chair, a different and far more powerful kind of fear. He was offering me a cage, yes, but it was a cage designed to keep the wolves out, not to keep me in. The alternative was to watch Sophia get devoured because I was too proud to admit I needed saving. The fight went out of me, leaving a hollow ache of defeat in its place. What do you want from me? I whispered, the words tasting like surrender. I was giving up. I was trading my freedom, or what little was left of it, for Sophia's safety. It was a transaction, a cold, hard bargain made in the currency of desperation, and it was the only move I had left to make. Dante leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into mine, holding me captive. The terms are straightforward. You will reside here, in a private suite with its own entrance. Your official role will be my private nurse. You will oversee the remainder of my recovery, changing my dressings, managing my medication, ensuring I don't tear my stitches. You will be compensated at triple your previous salary, and all outstanding debts in your name will be cleared by morning. As for Officer Jensen, he paused, and the air grew colder, heavier. He is no longer your concern. You will not speak to him, respond to him, or acknowledge his existence in any way. He is being dealt with. Your only responsibilities are to your patient and to your own peace of mind. That is the agreement. He held out his hand, not for me to shake, but as a silent, unyielding demand for my acceptance. Do we have a deal, Clara? The sound of my first name on his lips was both an intimacy and an act of possession. It sealed the pact. I stared at his hand, then met his gaze, and gave a single, sharp nod. The life I knew was over. A new, far more dangerous one had just begun. My new life began in a suite larger than my entire apartment, a place of silent, sterile luxury. The walls were a soft gray, the furniture was minimalist and severe, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of a city I no longer felt a part of. Leo had walked me through the protocols with polite detachment. My meals would be brought to my room, unless I was dining with Mr. Moretti. I was not to use the main elevators without an escort. My duties were simple: change Dante's dressing twice a day, administer his antibiotics, and monitor for any signs of infection. It sounded like a simple nursing job, but the unspoken rules hung in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sun. I was a guest, an employee, and a prisoner, all at once. My first appointment with him was excruciatingly tense. He sat in his armchair, shirtless, revealing a landscape of old scars around the fresh, angry line of my sutures. He said nothing as I worked, his eyes tracking my every move, his body unnervingly still. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on me, and I focused on the clinical task, the familiar rhythm of cleaning and dressing a wound, trying to forget that this particular wound had tethered my life to his. He broke the silence on the third day, his voice a low rumble that startled me. "Tell me about him." The cop. I froze, my hands hovering over his shoulder. I had been so careful not to let my guard down, to keep our interactions strictly professional. "There's nothing to tell," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "It's over." A dark, mirthless smile touched his lips. "Nothing is ever over until the threat is eliminated. He broke your wrist 2 years ago, dislocated your shoulder last year. He has 2 excessive force complaints that were buried by his precinct captain. He considers you his property." Each word was a cold, hard stone dropped into the quiet room, a testament to the terrifying thoroughness of his reach. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger. "I am not your project," I snapped, pulling the bandage tighter than necessary. He didn't even flinch. "No," he agreed, his gaze locking with mine, intense and unyielding. "You are not, but he is. A man who uses a badge to hide his depravity is a pest, and I have a very low tolerance for pests." His calm, matter-of-fact tone was more chilling than any scream could ever be. It wasn't a promise of a fight, it was a promise of an erasure. That night, sleep offered no escape. I was back in my old apartment, the air thick with Mark's cloying cologne, his voice whispering threats in my ear. I woke up with a strangled gasp, my heart pounding against my ribs, the sheets twisted around my legs like restraints. Shaking, I slipped out of bed and padded toward the vast, dark kitchen, needing a glass of water to wash the phantom taste of fear from my mouth. I wasn't alone. Dante was there, standing by the massive window, a silhouette against the glittering cityscape. He held a glass of what looked like whiskey in his uninjured hand. He turned as I entered, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I started to apologize, to retreat back to my room, but he simply gestured toward the counter. "I can't sleep either," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "The quiet is too loud." He didn't ask about my nightmare, but I knew he saw the lingering terror in my eyes. He poured a second glass of water and pushed it toward me. We stood there for a long time, two strangers, bound by violence, sharing a moment of silent, wounded camaraderie in the dead of night. The fragile peace was shattered the next afternoon. I was organizing medical supplies when Leo entered the penthouse, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a rigid tension. He spoke to Dante in a low, urgent tone, but in the cavernous silence of the apartment, I caught fragments of the conversation. "Petrov is asking questions. His people are sniffing around the hospital." A cold dread trickled down my spine. Petrov, the name of the rival Russian mob boss, the man responsible for the attack that had brought Dante to my ER. They know a nurse saved you. They're trying to get a name, a description. I felt Dante's eyes on me, and when I looked up, his face was a mask of cold fury. The brief connection we'd shared in the kitchen was gone, replaced by the unreadable gaze of a crime boss calculating risk. "Leave us," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a request. I retreated to my suite, the sound of the heavy door closing behind me feeling like a judgment. I wasn't a person to them in that moment. I was a loose end, a vulnerability in their armor, and the sudden, chilling realization made it hard to breathe. The consequences were immediate and suffocating. The next morning, Leo informed me of the updated security protocols. I was no longer permitted to leave the penthouse for any reason. A new guard was stationed permanently outside my suite's private entrance. My meals, previously a choice, were now delivered at set times. The illusion of being an employee evaporated, leaving the stark reality of my confinement. I felt a surge of defiant anger, a desperate need to push back against the shrinking walls of my world. "This is not what I agreed to," I argued, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I can't be a prisoner here." Leo regarded me with an expression of weary patience, his eyes holding no malice, only grim finality. "Miss Reed, the agreement was that Mr. Moretti would guarantee your safety. The nature of the threat has evolved. Therefore, the nature of the protection must evolve with it. Your personal freedom is secondary to your survival. This is not negotiable." I was trapped, my golden cage now reinforced with bars of cold, hard steel, and the man who held the key was the same one I had saved. I waited until my next session with Dante, my anger simmering just beneath a carefully constructed professional facade. As I was changing his dressing, I finally broke the silence. "You have no right to lock me in here." He was reviewing a ledger on a tablet, and he didn't look up, his focus absolute. "My house, my rules," he stated simply. The dismissive tone scraped against my raw nerves. "I am not one of your possessions you can just put away for safekeeping," I said, my voice rising. "I'm a person." This time, he lowered the tablet, his dark eyes finally meeting mine. The sheer intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. He rose slowly from his chair, a predator unfolding to his full, intimidating height, and closed the distance between us. He stopped just inches away, forcing me to tilt my head back to look at him. "You are the woman who walked into a storm to pull me out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "That makes you my responsibility. Do not for 1 second confuse my methods for a lack of respect. I am keeping you safe, whether you appreciate the cage or not." The air between us crackled with a tension that was more than just anger. It was a volatile mix of fear, defiance, and a terrifying spark, something else entirely. My perception of his world and my place in it was constantly shifting. One evening, a young man named Marco, one of Dante's guards, arrived with a split lip and a darkening bruise on his cheekbone. He was trying to hide it, but I saw it immediately. Before I could stop myself, the nurse in me took over. I grabbed my kit, sat him down, and began cleaning the cut. He was barely older than a teenager, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and awe as I worked. Dante watched from his armchair, silent and observant. After I had finished, and Marco had left with mumbled thanks, Dante spoke. His father worked for my father. He died protecting him during the first war with the Petrov family. We look after our own, Clara. Loyalty is everything. He said it so simply, a fundamental truth of his existence. You were loyal to a stranger on a gurney that night. You chose to save me when everyone else was ready to let me die. That kind of loyalty is a debt that can never be fully repaid. I am not keeping you here to control you. I am keeping you here because you are one of us now. The word sent a shiver through me, a terrifying and strangely comforting revelation. The threat, when it finally breached the walls of the penthouse, was not loud or violent. It was silent, insidious, and aimed directly at my heart. A courier delivered a small, elegantly wrapped box to the front desk of the skyscraper. It was addressed simply to the nurse. Security cleared it, finding nothing explosive or electronic. Leo brought it upstairs, his face grim, and placed it on the large marble table in front of us. Dante nodded for him to open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a dead white bird, its wings folded peacefully, a single drop of crimson staining its feathers. Beneath it lay a photograph. My blood turned to ice. It was a picture of Sophia, my Sophia, laughing as she left the hospital after her shift, her face bright and full of life. A crude red circle had been drawn around her head like a target. There was no note, no message, but the meaning was brutally clear. We know who you are, we know what you value, and we can touch it whenever we want. I couldn't breathe. My past fears of Mark seemed small and insignificant compared to this new, all-encompassing terror. I had not escaped a monster. I had simply attracted bigger ones. I stumbled back, the photograph falling from my trembling fingers. A wave of nausea and guilt so profound it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. This was my fault. My presence here, my decision that night in the ER, had put a target on Sophia's back. I looked at Dante, and the man I saw was not the quiet, recovering patient or the reluctant protector. His face had become a mask of absolute, chilling fury. It was a stillness more terrifying than any rage, a promise of methodical annihilation. He picked up his phone and made a single call, his voice lethally calm. "Find them. I don't care what it takes. Bring me a name." He hung up and turned to me, his dark eyes boring into mine. "They will not harm her," he vowed, each word an unbreakable oath. "I will handle this." But as the words left his lips, my new phone, the secure one he had given me, buzzed on the table. A text message from an unknown number glowed on the screen. "We know you got our little gift. Your protector thinks his walls are high enough. They're not. The next time we reach out, it won't be with a picture." The threat wasn't just outside the gates anymore. It was in my hand, in my ear, proving that his fortress was made of glass. Dante's reaction to the text message was a terrifying display of absolute stillness. He didn't rage, he didn't shout. He simply became a black hole of fury, absorbing all the light and warmth in the room. He spent the next hour on the phone, his voice a low, lethal monotone as he issued a string of commands to people I couldn't see. He was a general moving his armies, and the chilling efficiency of it all made my skin crawl. When he was done, he turned to me, his face carved from granite. "We're leaving," he said. "Petrov's men are looking for a nurse. This city is no longer safe for you. I have a house in the country. It's remote, fortified. No one will find you there." It wasn't a suggestion. My protests died in my throat as I saw the look in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had on the gurney, a raw, burning intensity that demanded compliance. But this time, it wasn't a challenge to save his life. It was a command to let him save mine. Leo and 2 other guards packed a bag for me with unnerving speed, and within 20 minutes, we were descending in the private elevator, heading toward an armored car and a future I couldn't even begin to imagine. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon and gold as the sedan sped through the night, a silent black arrow cutting through the heart of the metropolis. I sat beside Dante in the back, the space between us charged with an unspoken tension. He hadn't said a word since we left the penthouse, his gaze fixed on the world outside, his jaw tight. I was a prisoner being transferred to a more secure facility, a precious object being moved from one vault to another. The thought was better, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold on to some small piece of my own identity. Just as we cleared the densest part of the city, heading toward the freeway on-ramp, it happened. A heavy black SUV, its headlights off, materialized from a side street and slammed into our rear quarter panel with a deafening shriek of metal on metal. The force of the impact threw me against Dante, my head connecting with his shoulder. Before I could even register the pain, a second SUV boxed us in from the front, tires screaming as it blocked our path. The world outside erupted in chaos, but inside the car, a sudden, terrifying silence fell, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Dante's reaction was instantaneous, a fluid explosion of controlled violence. In the split second after the impact, his uninjured arm shot out, not to brace himself, but to shove me down onto the floor of the car, his body a shield over mine. "Stay down, Clara. Do not move," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl right next to my ear. The windows, supposedly bulletproof, spiderwebbed as the first volley of automatic gunfire hit us, the sound a deafening, percussive roar that vibrated through my bones. Leo, in the front passenger seat, was already returning fire through a small, reinforced gun port. I could smell the sharp, acrid scent of cordite filling the small space, a smell I had only ever associated with the victims of violence, not the middle of it. I pressed my face against the plush carpet, my eyes squeezed shut, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. It was a lifetime of fear compressed into a few terrifying seconds, a brutal, visceral reminder that the walls Dante had built around me were not impenetrable. The monsters were not just outside the gates, they were here, and they were trying to tear their way in. The firefight was over almost as quickly as it began. I heard the squeal of tires as the attacking vehicles sped away, leaving behind a ringing silence punctuated by the tinkle of broken glass from a nearby storefront. A moment later, Dante's weight lifted off me. "It's clear," he said, his voice strained. I slowly pushed myself up, my body trembling uncontrollably. The interior of the car was a wreck, the windows opaque with cracks, the air thick with smoke. Dante was leaning back against the seat, his face pale, a small trickle of blood running from a cut on his temple where a piece of shrapnel must have hit him. He ignored it, his eyes scanning the darkness outside, his hand resting on the gun that had appeared from nowhere. Leo was on the radio, his voice a clipped, angry staccato, reporting the ambush. Dante's gaze finally fell on me, and for the first time, I saw something other than control in his eyes. It was a flicker of raw, unguarded fury, but it wasn't directed at our attackers. It was directed at himself. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. I shook my head, unable to speak, the terror having stolen my words. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before his fingers gently brushed a piece of glass from my hair. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender, it shattered the last of my composure. A choked sob escaped my lips, and then another, my body shaking with the delayed shock of the attack. It wasn't just the ambush, it was everything. It was Mark,
The hospital, the threats, the cage, the constant, unrelenting fear that had become the soundtrack of my life. I was breaking, and I was doing it in front of the one man I desperately wanted to believe was unbreakable. He didn't try to comfort me with empty words. Instead, he simply moved closer, his presence a solid, grounding weight in the chaotic aftermath. He took my trembling hands in his own, his grip firm and steady, anchoring me to the present moment. "Breathe, Clara," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to calm the frantic beating of my heart. "Just breathe. I have you. You're safe." In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his protection, his words felt like the only truth left in the world. I was not alone in the storm anymore. A new car arrived within minutes, and the transfer was a blur. We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with a shared, unspoken experience. The safe house was an old stone manor nestled deep within a thick forest, a fortress that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. Inside, it was warm and surprisingly comfortable, with a massive stone fireplace and worn leather furniture that spoke of generations of history. Leo saw to the security details while Dante led me to a large modern kitchen. He retrieved a first aid kit, the same kind I used, and set it on the heavy wooden table. "Let me see your head," he said, his voice back to its usual controlled tone, but his eyes held a new softness. I let him clean the small scrape on my forehead where I'd hit the window. Then I took the antiseptic wipe from his hand and gently dabbed at the cut on his temple. Our fingers brushed, and a jolt of electricity, sharp and undeniable, passed between us. We were no longer just a boss and his employee, a protector and his charge. We were two survivors, tending to each other's wounds in the quiet stillness of the night. Later, I found him standing on a stone terrace overlooking the dark, silent woods, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The night air was cold, but I felt drawn to the quiet space he occupied. I stood beside him, not speaking, just watching the stars that were invisible in the city. "My father was killed in an ambush just like that," he said, his voice low, and laced with a pain that sounded ancient. "They used my mother to get to him. They knew she went to the same market every Saturday morning. They knew he would send his best men with her, leaving himself exposed for a few hours. They used his love for her as a weapon against him. That's how this world works, Clara. They find the thing you care about most, and they use it to tear you down." He turned to look at me then, the moonlight catching the anguish in his eyes. "When they sent that picture of your friend, when they attacked us tonight, they weren't just trying to kill me. They were testing me. They were trying to see if you were my weakness." His confession hung in the air between us, a raw and devastating truth that changed everything. I saw it then, the crushing weight he carried. His control, his walls, his coldness, it was all a shield, not just for himself, but for anyone who dared to get close. It was a desperate attempt to avoid repeating the past, to prevent love from becoming a liability again. My fear of him, of his world, melted away, replaced by a wave of empathy so profound it felt like recognition. I reached out and laid my hand on his arm, over the fabric of his sleeve. He flinched, not from my touch, but from the emotion behind it. "I am not a weakness, Dante," I whispered, my voice fierce and sure. I was no longer the trembling victim on the floor of the car. I was the nurse who had held his life in her hands, the woman who had faced down her own monster for years. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back to my face, his expression a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, burgeoning hope. Just then, Leo appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Sir, we have a problem. The security feed from Sophia's apartment just went dark, and we just intercepted a message from Petrov. He says, we have his new favorite toy. The price just went up." The test was over. They had failed to take me, so they had taken the next best thing. The world fractured in the space of a heartbeat. Leo's words, a death sentence delivered in a calm, professional tone, obliterated the fragile peace we had found on the terrace. Dante's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The man who had shared his vulnerability, his history, was gone. In his place stood the Moretti, a creature of ice and shadow, his eyes hardening into black, emotionless voids. He didn't look at me, didn't offer a single word of comfort. I had ceased to be a person and had become a strategic problem. He began issuing a rapid-fire series of commands into his phone, his voice a low, lethal hum that promised retribution. The air crackled with his cold fury, a palpable force that pushed me away, that made me feel like an outsider, a contaminant in his sterile world of violence. He turned to Leo, his voice dropping even lower. "Take her to the master suite. Post 2 men on the door. She doesn't leave the room for any reason." The warmth of his protection had flash-frozen into the cold steel of a prison, and, as I was led away, I knew with sickening certainty that I had brought this plague upon Sophia, and Dante was simply locking down the source of the infection. The silence of my new prison was a living entity, feeding on my fear and amplifying it until it was the only thing I could hear. I paced the opulent room, the plush carpet a cruel mockery of comfort when my soul was being shredded. Every shadow held the image of Sophia's face, her laughter echoing in my memory, a ghost haunting me with what I had cost her. Dante never came. Leo was a silent specter, appearing only to leave a tray of food that I couldn't bring myself to touch, his face a grim mask of duty. My pleas for information were met with the same impenetrable wall. "Mr. Moretti is handling it." That phrase, once a shield that made me feel safe, was now a blade twisting in my gut. He was handling it like a business transaction, a hostile takeover, and my best friend was the asset being liquidated. I was completely cut off, a non-entity in the war that was being waged over my life. The guilt was a physical sickness, a poison seeping into my veins. I had walked out of one cage only to lead my friend into another, far more lethal one. I wasn't a survivor. I was a catalyst for destruction, and my very existence was a danger to everyone I loved. He finally came for me near dawn, looking like a wraith carved from stone. The exhaustion and fury radiating from him were so intense it felt like a physical blow. He didn't bother with pleasantries or apologies for my confinement. He just stood in the middle of the room, a pillar of cold, controlled rage, and delivered the blow. Petrov made contact. He wants to make a trade. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, a clinical diagnosis of a fatal condition. My breath caught in my throat, a knot of hope and terror tightening in my chest. He wants you in exchange for your friend. Of course, it was so simple, so brutal. I was the prize, and Sophia was just the leverage. A wave of relief, sharp and painful, washed over me. This was a solution, a terrible one, but a solution nonetheless. "Do it," I whispered, the words rushing out of me before I could even think. "Dante, you have to. Make the trade, please." I would walk into hell 1,000 times over to pull her out. But he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. And then he shook his head slowly, a single, devastating gesture that extinguished the tiny flicker of hope inside me. "No," he said, and the word was as final as a tombstone. "What do you mean, no?" I demanded, my voice rising with disbelief and panic. "You can't just let her die. This is my fault. You have to let me fix it." I stepped toward him, my hands clenched into fists, my entire being a raw nerve of desperation. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just watched me, his eyes as cold and distant as a winter sky. "I don't negotiate with men like Petrov," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And I don't trade what is mine." The possessive claim wasn't a comfort, it was a brand. It wasn't about protecting me, it was about refusing to lose. "She isn't yours to sacrifice," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. "She is an innocent person." He finally moved then, closing the space between us in a single predatory stride. She stopped being an innocent person the moment they put their hands on her, he hissed, his face inches from mine. She is a part of my world now.
Giving you up would be suicide for my family. It would be an open invitation for every rival to tear us apart using the people we care about. I will get her back, my way. This conversation is over. His cold, strategic logic, placing his empire above Sophia's life, wasn't just cruel, it was a betrayal of everything I thought he was. Our standoff was broken by a frantic knock on the door. Leo entered without waiting for a command, his face pale, his eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed even my own. He was holding a tablet, and he thrust it toward Dante, his hand shaking slightly. "Sir, you need to see this. We found the leak." Dante tore his gaze from me and looked at the screen. The change that came over him was terrifying to witness. The cold fury dissolved, replaced by a look of such profound shock and wounded disbelief that he physically stumbled back. His face crumpled, and a single name escaped his lips, a strangled whisper of pain. Marco. The name hit me like a physical blow. Marco, the young guard, the boy whose loyalty was supposed to be absolute, a legacy passed down from his father. Leo's voice was strained as he explained the unthinkable. Petrov had found Marco's sister, who was dying from a rare genetic disorder. He had offered to fund an experimental treatment, a cure, in exchange for information. Loyalty to the family versus loyalty to his blood. It was a choice no one should have to make. The foundation of Dante's world, the absolute certainty of his inner circle, had just crumbled into dust. Dante didn't say another word to me. He simply stared at the tablet for a long moment, the life draining from his face, leaving behind a hollow mask of grief and betrayal. Then he turned and strode out of the room, Leo following silently behind him, a loyal shadow to a broken king. The heavy door clicked shut, the sound echoing the final closing of a door in my own heart. I was left alone in the crushing silence, the revelation of Marco's betrayal hanging in the air like poison gas. It was proof that this world was irredeemable. Its very currency was pain, its bonds forged in blood and broken by desperation. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe a lifetime, a single, muffled pop echoed from outside. It was a flat, unremarkable sound, but I knew what it was. A gunshot, a sound of finality. And I knew, with a certainty that froze the marrow in my bones, that Dante had just executed the boy he had once called family. The line had been crossed. The protector, the man with the rigid moral code, had just murdered one of his own, out of necessity. The man I had saved was gone, and the monster he had to be to survive was all that was left. I had to run. It was the only thought that cut through the fog of my grief and terror. I could not be a part of this world, a world where a boy's life was forfeit for a mistake made out of love. I was the disease, the weakness they were all exploiting, and the only way to cure it was to cut myself out completely. While Dante was consumed by his grief and his rage, while his men were focused on the war outside the walls, I moved. I found a small service door in the cavernous pantry, a door meant for deliveries, not escapes. It was unlocked. I slipped out into the pre-dawn chill, the cold air a shock against my tear-stained cheeks. I had nothing, no phone, no money, no plan, just the crushing weight of Sophia's capture and the horrifying knowledge of what Dante was capable of. Every step I took into the dark, tangled woods was a step away from him, from the gilded cage that had almost convinced me it was a sanctuary. The fragile trust we had built, the fleeting moments of connection, had been lies. It was all gone, burned to ash by betrayal and blood. I was alone, hunted, and more broken than I had ever been in my life. The forest floor was a cold, damp sponge that sucked the warmth from my worn-out sneakers, each snapping twig an announcement of my pathetic escape. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed,
fueled by a cocktail of terror and a grief so sharp it felt like a physical wound in my chest. The muffled gunshot echoed in my mind, a definitive period at the end of a sentence I hadn't wanted to read. Dante had killed him. He had killed a boy who made a mistake out of love, and in that single, brutal act, he had become indistinguishable from the monsters he claimed to fight. The protector had become the predator, and the sanctuary was just a more beautifully decorated cage. But as dawn began to bleed through the canopy, a cold, hard clarity cut through my panic. Running was what Mark had trained me to do. Hiding was the response he had conditioned in me. I couldn't save Sophia by disappearing. I had to turn and face the storm, but I had to do it on my own terms. I was a nurse. I knew how to navigate systems, how to find information. My world wasn't just guns and shadows. It was people, records, and vulnerabilities. I wouldn't be a pawn in their game anymore. I would become a player. I made my way to the nearest town, a forgotten speck on the map, where I sold the only thing of value I had on me, a simple gold necklace my mother had given me, for a few $100s. It was enough for a bus ticket back to the city, a burner phone, and a change of clothes from a thrift store. I looked like a ghost, a hollowed-out version of myself, which was the perfect camouflage. Hiding in plain sight, I began my own quiet investigation.
I couldn't go to the police, and I couldn't trust Dante's world, but I had a memory, a detail from the ER that had seemed insignificant at the time. A few months ago, I had treated a young Russian man for a knife wound, a man with a distinctive two-headed eagle tattooed on his neck. He'd been arrogant, dismissive, but he'd let slip the name of a specific bar in the Brighton Beach neighborhood where he worked security. It was a long shot, a desperate, flimsy thread, but it was mine. It was a plan born not from power or violence, but from observation and care, the only weapons I had ever learned to wield. I was walking back into the fire, but this time I was carrying my own torch. The bar was a cavern of dark wood, stale cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of a language I didn't understand. It felt like stepping onto another planet. For 2 days, I sat in a coffee shop across the street, nursing a single cup for hours, watching. I learned the rhythms of the place, the comings and goings of the men with dead eyes in expensive suits. On the 3rd day, I saw him, the man from the ER. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. I followed him at a distance when his shift ended, my body coiled with a fear so intense it was almost paralyzing. He led me to a row of dilapidated warehouses by the waterfront, a place where the city seemed to crumble into the sea. And then I saw it, a black van, identical to the one that had been parked outside Sophia's building on Dante's security feed. They were here. Sophia was here. My desperation warred with my terror, and a reckless plan began to form. I couldn't fight them, but I could be a nuisance. I could be a distraction. I found a public phone and made an anonymous call to the fire department, reporting a gas leak at the adjacent warehouse. It was a stupid, desperate move, but it was all I had. The scream of sirens split the night air, and for a moment, chaos reigned. Men poured out of the warehouse, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger, looking for the source of the alarm. It was the opening I needed. I slipped through a side door left ajar in the panic, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The inside was vast, cold, and smelled of dust and decay. And then I heard her voice, a muffled cry from a small office in the back. I found her, tied to a chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked, but her eyes, when they saw me, blazed with a fierce, defiant light. As I frantically worked on her ropes, a voice, cold and amused, spoke from the doorway. "The little mouse comes for the cheese." It was Petrov. He was older than I expected, with pale, reptilian eyes that held a chilling emptiness. He held a gun, aimed not at me, but at Sophia. "Now we call your protector," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. The hope I had clung to dissolved into pure, undiluted horror. My plan hadn't saved her. It had just gotten us both trapped. Before Petrov could make the call, the world exploded. The main warehouse doors burst inward with a deafening crash, and the room was flooded with shadows and tactical gear, moving with a silent, lethal grace that was terrifyingly familiar. Dante was at their center, a figure of pure, controlled fury, his eyes finding mine across the chaotic space. Petrov shoved me forward, using me as a shield, but he had underestimated me. He had underestimated the rage of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I stomped down hard on his instep with the heel of my boot, and as he grunted in pain, I drove my elbow back into his solar plexus with all my strength. It was a move Mark had used on me 100 times, and the bitter irony of it fueled my fury. The momentary opening was all Dante needed. A single, precise shot from his weapon sent Petrov's gun skittering across the concrete floor. In the ensuing chaos, as his men efficiently subdued Petrov's guards, I didn't hide. I grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench, my knuckles white, ready to fight for the life I had just reclaimed. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, standing shoulder to shoulder with the devil who had come back from hell to find me. In the quiet aftermath, with Sophia safe and being looked after by a grim-faced Leo, Dante walked toward me through the debris. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of exhaustion and a raw vulnerability I had never seen before. "Marco is alive, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A gunshot was for Petrov's informant. I sent Marco to find you, to protect you from a distance. He tracked you from the moment you bought that bus ticket. He led us here." The confession was a balm on my shattered soul. The monster I had imagined was just a man who had made an impossible choice to protect his own. He held out a small leather-bound folder. Inside was a passport with my picture and a new name, along with bank details for an account that held more money than I could ever spend. "This is your way out," he said, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored my own. He was offering me an escape, the ultimate act of love, letting me go. I looked at the passport, at the promise of a quiet, simple existence. Then I looked at him, at this dangerous, broken, and beautiful man. I closed the folder and pushed it back into his hands. "My home is not a place, Dante," I whispered, my voice finally steady. "It's you." The quiet that followed the storm was a sound I had never known. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace, a deep, resonant stillness that settled in my bones and told me I could finally stop running. We left the city behind, its jagged skyline of glass and steel, a monument to a life I no longer wanted. Dante's country home, once a temporary fortress, became our sanctuary. The stone walls that had once felt like a prison now felt like an embrace, shielding us from a world that had tried to tear us apart. Petrov's organization crumbled in the weeks that followed, not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet, methodical precision that was Dante's signature. He absorbed what was useful and dismantled the rest, a corporate takeover where the assets were loyalty and the liabilities were erased. I watched him work, not as a terrified observer, but as a partner. He would ask my opinion, my perspective on the people left in the wake of the conflict, valuing my insight into human nature over the cold calculus of his lieutenants. He was still a dangerous man, but the purpose of his power had shifted. It was no longer just about survival or dominance. It was about building a foundation for the life we had chosen, a life where the loudest sound was the wind in the trees outside our window. My hands, which had once trembled with fear, now found a new purpose. With Dante's quiet backing, I began drawing up plans for something I had only ever dreamed of, a free clinic in the nearest town, a place for those who, like me, had fallen through the cracks of a system that was never designed to catch them. Sophia, her own trauma slowly healing under the blanket of our newfound security, agreed to be my head nurse, her laughter once again filling the spaces that had been hollowed out by fear. Leo, the ever-watchful consigliere, transformed from my warden into our fiercest advocate, cutting through bureaucratic red tape with the same quiet efficiency he once used to manage threats. He'd visit the construction site, his stern face breaking into a rare smile as he watched the walls go up. This clinic was more than just a building. It was a testament to our victory. It was proof that the power Dante wielded could be a force for creation, not just destruction. It was a place where my skills could be used to mend the broken, to offer a safe harbor to those lost in their own storms. A promise that no one had to be invisible in their pain ever again. It was a future built from the ashes of our past. One evening, as we sat on the stone terrace, the same one where he had first told me about his mother, Dante turned to me, his expression serious. He held out a small velvet box. My breath caught, but inside wasn't a diamond or some ostentatious jewel. It was a simple, elegant gold band, intricately carved with what looked like olive branches. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "She believed that peace was the only true victory. I never understood what she meant until I met you. You are my peace, Clara." He slid the ring onto my finger, and it felt not like a claim, but like a homecoming. I looked at this man, the feared Dante Moretti, and I no longer saw the monster or the kingpin. I saw the survivor who had stood in the dark with me, the man who had torn down an empire to save my friend, the partner who saw my strength when all I felt was weakness. I leaned my head against his shoulder, the one I had stitched back together, and felt the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The debt between us had been paid long ago, replaced by something far more precious, a bond forged not in violence and fear, but in mutual respect and a quiet, unwavering love. A year later, the clinic was open, its waiting room filled with the quiet hum of hope. Children's laughter echoed in the hallway where there had once only been the sterile silence of fear. I stood at the large window in my new office, looking out not at a rain-slicked alley or a city that held me captive, but at a garden Sophia had planted, bursting with color and life. Dante came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. We didn't need to speak. The peace was a language we both understood now. My life was no longer defined by the man I had run from, but by the one I had run toward. I had found my place, not as a prize to be protected, but as an architect of a new world, a partner to a man who had learned that true power was the ability to build, to heal, to love. The scars were still there, on both of us, but they were no longer wounds. They were just a map of the journey that had brought us home. And as I watched a young mother leave the clinic, her baby safe in her arms, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for my own second chance, but for the community that makes stories like this possible. Thank you for listening.